I didn't lose my daughter in one dramatic moment. There was no kidnapping, no court officer dragging her away while I screamed, no single headline that could hold the whole disaster. It was quieter than that, crueler in a way that still makes my stomach tighten. I lost her to a story. A story my ex-husband told in court with a steady voice and expensive witnesses behind him. A story about me being unstable, controlling, dangerous. A story his family could afford to repeat until it sounded like truth. And for 17 years, my daughter Sarah lived inside that story. Then, last week, Sarah, my 17-year-old, sat across from me in a small cafe with a manuscript in her bag and a look on her face like she'd been carrying a secret made of broken glass. I wrote a book, she said. Her hands were calm, but I noticed the way her thumb kept rubbing the edge of her cup, like she needed something solid to hold on to. It's fiction, she added quickly, almost defensively, but it's based on my life. I thought she meant her school life, friends, first heartbreak, the normal things a 17-year-old might pour onto paper. Then she slid a printed page toward me, and I saw the opening scene. A little girl in a dark apartment, a parent asleep at noon, a TV blaring like it was hired to raise her. Hunger described in a way that felt too accurate to be imagined. The mother character in the book wasn't the villain. The father character was. Neglectful, selfish, charming in public, absent in private, the kind of man who could smile for photos and disappear when the door closed. My throat went tight as I kept reading, because I recognized the details Sarah could only know if she'd lived them. And then she said the line that snapped something deep in me. Mom, people wanted to publish it. I stared at her, at the same eyes I used to kiss goodnight when she was small, and my mind split into two voices at war. One voice was pride, so fierce it hurt. She survived. She turned pain into art. She's brilliant. The other voice was terror. If this goes out into the world, he will come for her. He will come for you, and everything you buried will crawl back into daylight. Sarah watched me like she was bracing for rejection, like she'd been trained to expect love with conditions. I swallowed, feeling my pulse hammer in my ears, and I realized I wasn't just deciding whether to support a book. I was deciding whether I was ready to fight the same lies all over again, this time with my daughter standing beside me instead of behind a courtroom door. My name is Maya. I'm 42 now, but the version of me that matters in this story was 25, exhausted, stubborn, and still naive enough to believe love could fix incompatibility. Sarah's father, Ethan, was 24 when we met. He had this effortless charisma that made people lean in when he spoke. The kind of man who could make your friends laugh in 10 minutes and make your mother say, "He seems like a good one." He worked in marketing at the time, always talking about big opportunities, always planning the next move. I was the opposite, steady, practical, and trying to build something real. I grew up with a complicated relationship to family. My own father wasn't a monster, but he was inconsistent, present when it suited him, absent when it didn't. I learned early that if you wanted stability, you had to be it. That lesson hardened me in ways people misread. I wasn't cold. I was careful. When I got pregnant with Sarah, it wasn't planned, but I remember the moment the test turned positive, like it branded itself into my brain. I sat on the edge of the bathtub, palm pressed to my stomach, whispering, "Okay, okay," like I could coach myself into bravery. Ethan reacted with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We'll figure it out," he said. And I believed him, because I wanted to. For the first year, we tried to play house. I worked as a junior copywriter at a small agency. Nothing glamorous, but it was honest. Ethan's job paid better, but his spending matched it. New phone upgrades, dinners out, impulsive purchases justified as networking. When Sarah was born, we agreed I'd return to work quickly and Ethan would support us while I rebuilt momentum. Except support became a word that meant I did the work, and he took the credit for the appearance of stability. When Sarah was a baby, Ethan loved her in public. He posted photos of himself holding her like a prize, captioned with things like "girl dad life" and "my whole heart." People would comment, "Such a great father," and he'd grin, soaking it up. But at home was different. At home, when Sarah cried at 2 a.m., Ethan would sigh like her needs were an inconvenience he'd been tricked into. He'd roll over, mumble that he had an early morning, and leave me sitting up in the dark, rocking her until my arms ached. I told myself it was normal. New parents are tired, couples adjust. Then the small things started piling into something I couldn't ignore. If Sarah had a diaper rash, Ethan would say I was overreacting and obsessed with perfection. If I asked him to stop leaving dirty bottles in the sink, he'd call me controlling. If I asked him to hold Sarah while I showered, he'd act like I'd asked him to donate a kidney. By the time Sarah was a toddler, my marriage felt like I was living beside a man, not with him. He didn't hit me. He didn't scream every day. He didn't do the obvious dramatic things that make people instantly believe you. He did something harder to explain. He undermined me. He'd question my decisions in front of friends. He'd joke that I was intense, that I worried too much, that I had issues. When I tried to talk about how alone I felt, he'd tilt his head and say softly, like he was concerned, "Maybe you should talk to someone." And he meant it the way you mean. You're the problem, not me. The first time I realized I needed to protect Sarah, not just love her, was the day I came home early, hoping to surprise them with a park trip, and found the apartment silent. No Ethan, no Sarah, no text, no note. Just emptiness that made my blood turn cold. When they finally came back hours later, Ethan walked in like nothing happened, Sarah limp with exhaustion in his arms, her snack cup empty, her cheeks streaked with dried tears. "What were you thinking?" I demanded, voice shaking. He blinked, calm, almost amused. "We went out," he said. "Relax." That was the day I understood. Ethan didn't see Sarah's needs as urgent. He saw my concern as a weakness he could frame as instability. And I didn't know it yet, but he was already collecting that framing like evidence. The real danger didn't arrive all at once. It seeped in slowly, disguising itself as concern, as help, as reasonable questions asked by the wrong people. After that afternoon, when Ethan disappeared with Sarah for hours, something in me shifted. I started paying closer attention, not because I wanted to build a case, but because my body no longer trusted the calm he performed so well. I noticed how often he framed my boundaries as emotional instability. If I asked him not to take Sarah out without telling me, he'd sigh and say, "You can't control everything, Maya." If I asked him to stick to her nap schedule, he'd laugh and tell his mother I was rigid. And his mother, Linda, loved that word. "She's very structured," Linda would say, lips pursed, eyes flicking to Ethan like they were sharing a private joke. Some women just have a hard time relaxing into motherhood. Relaxing. As if caring whether your toddler eats or sleeps or feels safe was some neurotic hobby. Ethan's family lived close enough to be involved, but not close enough to see the day-to-day reality. They saw curated moments, birthday photos, social media posts, carefully timed visits when Ethan was attentive and charming. They didn't see Sarah tugging on his pant leg while he scrolled his phone. They didn't hear him snap, "Not now," when she asked him to play. I did. I started keeping notes, not officially, not with a lawyer in mind, just small things written in the margins of my planner. Sarah left alone with TV on for 3 hours. No lunch given until 3 p.m. Dirty diaper unchanged. Every time I wrote something down, my stomach twisted with guilt. What kind of wife documents her husband? What kind of mother plans for failure instead of believing in improvement? But the notes kept growing. When I brought my concerns up gently, could we take a parenting class? Could we talk to someone together? Ethan would stiffen. "Why are you always making this dramatic?" he'd ask. "You act like I'm some kind of monster." I wasn't calling him a monster. I was asking him to show up. That distinction mattered to me. It never mattered to him. The first time he suggested I was emotionally unstable, it was subtle. We were arguing quietly in the kitchen while Sarah napped. "You know," he said, rubbing his temples, "my parents have noticed you seem overwhelmed lately." My chest tightened. "What does that mean?" "It just means maybe you're projecting your anxiety onto Sarah," he replied, calm, measured, reasonable. "You're always tense. Kids feel that." I stared at him, heat flooding my face. "I'm tired because I'm doing most of the work." He shrugged. "That's your perception." That phrase, your perception, became his favorite weapon. When Ethan started working late more often, I suspected an affair before I suspected what was actually happening. But even that discovery didn't hit the way I expected. I found the messages accidentally. A woman from his office, casual at first, then intimate, then explicit. When I confronted him, he didn't deny it. He leaned back against the counter, arms crossed, and said, "You've been impossible to live with, Maya." Like the affair was a symptom of me. "I stayed for Sarah," he added, as if that was noble. That was the moment the marriage truly ended. Not because of betrayal, but because I realized Ethan was already rehearsing a version of events where he was the victim and I was the threat. When I told him I wanted a divorce, he didn't panic. He smiled, small, controlled, almost relieved. "Okay," he said, "but we'll need to be careful about custody." The way he said careful sent a chill through me. From that day forward, his tone changed. Conversations felt recorded. Every disagreement felt documented in some invisible file. He'd provoke me quietly, then step back and watch to see if I'd react. And sometimes, God help me, I did. I raised my voice. I cried. I begged him to stop making everything a strategy. And every reaction became another brick in the story he was building. The story where he was the stable parent, and I was the problem. The custody battle didn't begin in a courtroom. It began the day Ethan walked out of our apartment with a suitcase and said, almost gently, "I think it's best if Sarah stays with me for a while. You need time to stabilize." I remember the sound of the zipper more than the words. That harsh, final scrape as he closed the suitcase like he was sealing a decision already made. "No," I said immediately. "She stays here." Ethan didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He just tilted his head, the way he did when he wanted to look reasonable. "Maya," he said softly, "you've been having breakdowns. You cry all the time. You yell. I'm worried about her." I laughed, one sharp, disbelieving sound. "You're worried about her now?" He sighed, like this was exhausting for him. "See, this is what I mean." That was the moment I understood the trap. Anything I did, anger, fear, desperation, would be used as proof. I grabbed Sarah, who was sitting on the rug stacking blocks, completely unaware that her world was about to fracture. I pressed my face into her hair and breathed her in, my hands shaking. "She's not going anywhere," I said, my voice cracking despite my effort to keep it steady. Ethan stepped back, palms raised. "I don't want to fight," he said. "I just want what's best for her." 2 days later, I was served papers. Ethan filed for primary custody, citing emotional instability, controlling behavior, and an unsafe home environment. Unsafe. The word punched the air out of my lungs when I read it. The court date came fast. Too fast for me to understand how serious this was. I thought, naively, that the truth would be enough. That the notes I'd kept, the exhaustion etched into my face, the reality of my daily caregiving would speak for itself. I didn't yet understand how stories win over facts. Ethan's family hired a lawyer who smiled too easily and spoke in calm, authoritative tones. They brought character witnesses, friends, co-workers, his mother. Linda took the stand in a soft cardigan and pearls, hands folded like she was at church. "I've always been concerned about Maya," she said, voice trembling just enough. "She loves Sarah, of course, but she's very intense, high-strung. I worry about the emotional environment." The judge nodded sympathetically. When it was my turn, my lawyer encouraged me to stay calm, to be concise, to avoid sounding defensive. "But how do you compress years of invisible labor into sound bites? How do you explain neglect that isn't dramatic enough to shock, but constant enough to erode a child?" When I tried to describe coming home to an unchanged diaper, the judge frowned slightly. "When was the last time this happened?" he asked. I don't remember exact dates," I admitted. Ethan's lawyer smiled. When I described Sarah being left in front of the TV for hours, the response was clinical. "Many parents allow screen time," the judge said. When I mentioned Ethan's affair, it was dismissed as irrelevant. Marital issues do not necessarily reflect parental fitness. Then came the moment that still replays in my head at night. Ethan took the stand. He spoke slowly, carefully. He talked about his love for Sarah, about wanting consistency, about how hard it was to watch his wife struggle. "Maya isn't a bad person," he said, shaking his head sadly. "She just has episodes." Episodes. I felt heat rush to my face, my hands clenched in my lap. "She yells," he continued. "She cries. She fixates. I've tried to help, but she refuses therapy." "That's not true," I whispered, but no one heard me. His lawyer asked, "Do you believe your daughter is safe with her mother?" Ethan paused, like this pained him. "I'm not sure," he said. That was it. That hesitation. That carefully placed doubt. The judge ruled in Ethan's favor. Primary custody to him. Visitation to me every other weekend. I remember standing when the decision was read, my legs weak, my vision blurring. I remember Sarah clinging to my leg afterward, confused, asking why she couldn't come home with me. I knelt in front of her, my heart breaking so violently I thought I might pass out. "Mommy loves you," I said, smoothing her hair with trembling fingers. "This isn't forever." Ethan stood behind her, one hand resting possessively on her shoulder. He didn't look at me. As they walked away, Sarah turned back once, her little face crumpling. "Mom," she called. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. The door closed. And just like that, my motherhood became a schedule, approved by a judge who had never watched me rock my daughter to sleep. Grief doesn't always arrive as tears. Sometimes it shows up as numbness, so thick you feel like you're moving through water, watching your own life from a distance you can't cross. After the custody ruling, I went home to an apartment that still smelled like Sarah, baby lotion and crayons and the faint sweetness of her shampoo. Her shoes were by the door. Her stuffed rabbit sat on the couch like it was waiting for her to come back. I stood there for a long time, keys still in my hand, unable to move. Every other weekend. That was what the court had reduced my motherhood to. The first weekend without her, I didn't sleep. I lay on the couch listening to the hum of the refrigerator, my mind replaying the courtroom over and over like I could find a different ending if I studied it hard enough. You should have stayed calmer. You should have documented more. You should have left earlier. The blame turned inward, sharp and relentless. When Sarah came for her first visit, she was quieter than I remembered. She watched me carefully, like she was learning new rules. "Daddy says you're sad a lot," she told me one night as I tucked her into bed. The words sliced deeper than anything Ethan had said. "I get sad sometimes," I admitted, brushing her hair back. "But that doesn't change how much I love you." She nodded, but I could see the doubt flicker behind her eyes. That doubt became my constant companion. Ethan didn't just win custody. He controlled the narrative. Every time Sarah came to me, she carried fragments of it. "Daddy says you get mad at people. Daddy says you worry too much. Daddy says you don't like when he helps." I learned quickly that defending myself only made things worse. Any pushback risked reinforcing the idea that I was emotional, reactive, unstable. So I adjusted. I became careful with my words, soft, measured. I swallowed anger and swallowed grief and swallowed the urge to scream that none of this was fair. And in doing so, I lost parts of myself I'm still trying to recover. I fought for more time. I sent emails asking for extra evenings, phone calls, holidays. Most went unanswered. When Ethan did respond, it was brief and cold. "Sarah has a routine. This isn't your weekend. Please stop harassing me." Harassing. That word echoed like an accusation. Every request I made became evidence against me. Every attempt to stay connected was framed as instability. So I stopped pushing as hard. I hated myself for it, but I was afraid that if I made one wrong move, he'd take even more away. In the absence of my daughter, I poured myself into work. Writing became the only place I could breathe. Late at night, I filled notebooks with half-finished stories, characters who fought for their children and won. It was escapism, but it was survival too. I published a few short pieces online, nothing big. But each time someone commented that my words made them feel seen, it steadied me. I always hoped, quietly, desperately, that one day Sarah would read something I'd written and recognize me in it. Not the version Ethan described. The real one. Years passed in this uneasy rhythm. Sarah grew taller. Her visits grew more guarded. She stopped reaching for me automatically, stopped curling into my side on the couch. By the time she was 12, she barely spoke during visits. She'd answer questions politely, but her eyes were somewhere else, already halfway gone. I tried therapy, parenting books, mediation requests. Ethan declined most of it. When Sarah turned 14, something unexpected happened. Ethan dropped her off for a full week. "I have a trip," he said, not meeting my eyes. "She'll stay with you." Sarah stood behind him, arms crossed, face hard. "I don't want to be here," she said flatly. I nodded, even though it hurt. "That's okay," I said. "You don't have to want anything." That week started awkward and tense. But slowly, over shared meals, quiet games, long silences, it cracked something open. One night, as we played Scrabble, Sarah stared at the board for a long time, then suddenly whispered, "Did you ever not want me?" My chest tightened. "Never," I said immediately. "Not for 1 second." Her letters dropped from her hand. And then she cried, not loud, not dramatic, but with a quiet, shaking grief that felt like it had been stored for years. That was the first time she told me what life with Ethan was really like. And the first time I realized the story was finally starting to unravel. Bankamun tiptok fan tip teokom. Once the truth started leaking out of Sarah, it didn't come as a single confession. It came in fragments, small, devastating pieces she seemed to test in the air before letting them land. That week she stayed with me. The apartment felt different, heavier, charged. Sarah moved like she didn't trust the ground to hold her. She kept her phone close, screen face down, flinching every time it buzzed. The first night, she barely ate. The second night, she asked if she could sleep with the light on. I didn't ask why. On the third night, we were sitting at the kitchen table, homework spread between us. I was helping her with an essay, something about symbolism in literature, when she suddenly said, without looking up, "Dad doesn't like it when I talk too much." My pen paused mid-sentence. "What do you mean?" I asked carefully. She shrugged. "He says I get dramatic, that I exaggerate things." The words hit me like déjà vu so sharp it made my vision blur. I kept my voice steady. "What kinds of things does he say you exaggerate?" Sarah hesitated, then laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. Like when I tell him I'm tired, or hungry, or lonely. Lonely. She finally looked at me then, eyes glossy, but defiant, like she was daring me to dismiss her the way everyone else had. "He leaves me alone a lot," she said, "sometimes overnight. He says I'm old enough to handle it." My hands curled into fists under the table. "How often?" I asked. She shrugged again. "I don't know. A lot." I stood up, pretending to rinse a cup in the sink so she wouldn't see my face collapse. This wasn't new behavior. This was the same neglect I'd tried to warn the court about, just repackaged, now that Sarah was old enough to be ignored instead of tended. That night, after Sarah went to bed, I sat on the bathroom floor and cried silently into a towel like I used to when she was a baby. The grief felt familiar, but sharper now, edged with rage. I had lost custody to a man who was doing exactly what I said he would, and no one had listened. Over the next few days, Sarah opened up more. She told me how Ethan criticized her constantly. Her clothes, her grades, her tone. How he'd compare her to other kids and say things like, "Why can't you be more grateful?" How he'd vent to her about his relationships, his stress, his disappointments, like she was a roommate instead of a child. "He says you turned me against him," she added quietly one evening. I closed my eyes. "What do you think?" She was silent for a long time. "I think I didn't really know you," she said. "Not the way he said you were." That admission broke something open between us. For the first time in years, Sarah asked me about the divorce, about the court, about why things happened the way they did. I didn't lie. But I didn't unload everything either. I told her the truth in pieces she could hold. That I'd tried to protect her. That I'd made mistakes. That I never stopped fighting, even when it looked like I did. She listened with a focus that scared me. "You tried to tell people," she said slowly, "and they didn't believe you." "Yes," I said, "and I'm sorry." "For what?" she asked. "For not being able to change the outcome." She shook her head. "That's not on you." When Ethan came to pick her up at the end of the week, Sarah barely spoke to him. She hugged me tightly before leaving, her arms locking around my waist like she was afraid I'd disappear again. "I'll call," she whispered. And she did. At first, it was short calls, 10 minutes, then longer ones. Homework questions turned into late-night conversations about books, about school, about how trapped she felt. Ethan didn't like it. He sent me an email accusing me of overstepping boundaries and manipulating Sarah emotionally. I read it twice, hands shaking, before closing my laptop. I didn't respond. Sarah began pushing back at his house, asking where he was going, why he wasn't home, why she had to take care of herself all the time. He didn't react well. "He says you're filling my head with nonsense," she told me one night. "He says you always wanted to make him look bad." The escalation was inevitable after that. Sarah started spending more time at my place, unofficially at first, a weekend here, an extra night there. Ethan complained, but he didn't stop it. I think part of him was relieved not to deal with her. When Sarah turned 17, she made a decision that stunned me. "I'm moving out," she said calmly, sitting across from me at the same kitchen table where she'd once cried into her hands. "Out where?" I asked. "I found a studio apartment near campus," she said. "I'm taking college classes early. I got a scholarship." Pride and fear slammed into me at the same time. "You could live here," I said immediately. "You don't have to do this alone." She smiled, soft, grateful, but shook her head. "I need space, but I want you in my life. For real." I nodded, even though my chest ached. It was after she moved out that she told me about the book. The writing started as journaling, then scenes, then chapters. She didn't write it to punish Ethan. She wrote it to survive him. And when she asked me how I felt about it, I realized the conflict was no longer about the past. It was about whether I would stand beside my daughter now, knowing exactly how ugly the fallout could be. Because this time, the truth wasn't whispered in court. It was about to be published. The night Sarah handed me the full manuscript, I didn't read it all at once. I couldn't. I started in the living room, sitting on the edge of the couch with my feet flat on the floor like grounding myself might keep the memories from pulling me under. I told myself I'd read a chapter or two, just enough to understand what she was putting into the world. By the third chapter, my hands were shaking. By the sixth, I had to stop. Because the mother in the book, the one readers would assume was fictional, was doing things that felt too familiar to ignore. Sleeping through the day, forgetting to buy groceries, leaving a child alone with a locked door and no explanation. I pressed the manuscript to my chest and stared at the dark TV screen, my reflection ghosted over the glass. I had known Ethan was neglectful. I hadn't known how bad it had become. The worst part wasn't the anger I felt toward him. It was the guilt. I left her there. I'd fought, yes. I'd lost, yes. But knowing Sarah lived through years of emotional abandonment, years I couldn't stop, felt like a failure that lodged itself under my ribs and refused to move. That night, I dreamed of the courtroom again. Except this time, Sarah was standing beside me, holding the evidence I'd never been allowed to show. And the judge still turned away. When I finally finished the manuscript 2 days later, I called Sarah. "It's powerful," I said, my voice tight. "It's devastating." She was quiet on the other end. "Do you think I'm a bad person for writing it?" she asked. That question, small, vulnerable, broke me. "No," I said immediately. "You're brave." She exhaled, like she'd been holding her breath for weeks. But bravery doesn't cancel consequences. I started imagining the fallout the moment that book hit shelves. Ethan would recognize himself instantly, even if the names were changed. He'd rage. He'd threaten. He'd try to rewrite the story the way he always did. And then there was the thing I hadn't said out loud yet. "What about your father?" I asked carefully. "Have you thought about how he might react?" There was a pause, then, "He already reacts," Sarah said quietly. "I just stopped pretending it's not happening." That night, after we hung up, my phone buzzed. A message from Ethan. "Sarah seems distant lately. I don't know what you're telling her, but you need to stop interfering." My chest tightened. I typed, deleted, typed again. "I'm not interfering. She's 17. She's allowed to have thoughts." The reply came fast. "You've always been good at playing the victim." I put the phone face down and leaned my forehead against the table. This was it, the familiar low point, the moment where fear tried to convince me that silence would be safer, that backing away would hurt less than standing firm. For 17 years, I'd lived in the shadow of that fear. And here it was again, whispering. "If you support her, you'll make everything worse. If you stay quiet, maybe he'll calm down. If you don't challenge the story, it won't hurt so much." But then I thought about Sarah at 14, curled on my couch, whispering that she felt invisible. I thought about the way her voice shook when she asked if I'd ever not wanted her. And I realized something painful and clarifying. The dark moment wasn't the book. The dark moment was the possibility that I'd fail her again by prioritizing peace over truth. I met Sarah the next day at her apartment. It was small and sparsely furnished, books stacked everywhere, a thrifted desk by the window. She looked tired but determined. "I need to know something," she said, sitting across from me. "Are you going to be okay with this? Really okay?" I looked at her, this young woman who had survived things no child should have to survive and turned it into something meaningful. I felt the fear rise again, and then I let it pass. "I'm scared," I admitted, "but I'm not scared of you telling the truth." Her eyes filled with tears. "That's all I needed," she whispered. Outside, the sky was heavy with clouds, the kind that threaten rain but don't quite break. It felt exactly like the calm before something enormous. And for the first time, instead of bracing to be crushed by it, I chose to stand. The shift didn't come with a dramatic announcement. It came quietly, the way real power changes always do, inside my chest, in the space where fear used to sit. After our conversation, Sarah moved forward with the publisher. Contracts were signed. Edits were made. The title was finalized. A cover mock-up appeared in her inbox, and when she showed it to me, her hands were steady. Mine weren't. But something inside me had changed. I wasn't scrambling anymore. I wasn't trying to anticipate Ethan's reactions, or soften the impact, or manage everyone else's emotions at the expense of my own. For the first time since the divorce, I wasn't reacting. I was choosing. When the book was announced online, it spread faster than either of us expected. Readers connected immediately. Messages poured in, people thanking Sarah for putting words to things they'd never been able to say out loud. She showed me one email in particular, from a girl her age. "I thought I was crazy for feeling this way about my mom. Your book made me realize I'm not alone." Sarah read it twice, blinking hard. "That's why I did it," she said, "even if everything else blows up." And it did. Ethan showed up at my door 2 days after the release. He didn't knock. He pounded. I didn't open it. Through the door, his voice was sharp, furious, cracking at the edges. "You manipulated her," he shouted. "You poisoned her against me. I know this was you." I leaned my back against the door, heart racing, but my voice stayed level when I answered. "She wrote her own story," I said. "You don't get to control that." He laughed, a bitter sound. "You always wanted to destroy me." "That's not true," I replied. "I wanted you to take responsibility." There was silence after that. Then the sound of something breaking, one of my planters shattering on the porch. I called a lawyer that afternoon. Not to attack, to protect. The cease and desist letters, the documentation, the boundaries, it was all handled calmly, methodically. No yelling, no pleading, no spiraling. Ethan tried to threaten a defamation lawsuit. The lawyer shut it down in one phone call. Truth, it turns out, is a very solid defense. The real turning point, though, came a week later, when Sarah's grandparents reached out. They hadn't spoken to me since the custody trial. Back then, they'd testified against me, said they were concerned, said they'd seen signs. Now they were apologizing. "I think we were wrong," her grandmother said over the phone, voice shaking. "We didn't see it. Or maybe we didn't want to." I closed my eyes, a wave of old anger threatening to rise. But I thought about Sarah. "This isn't my decision," I said carefully. "It's hers." When I told Sarah about the call, she didn't explode. She didn't cry. She just nodded slowly, like she'd expected this moment eventually. "They ignored me when I tried to tell them," she said. "I'm not ready." And that was it. No guilt, no pressure, no forcing forgiveness for the comfort of others. Watching her set that boundary with such clarity was the moment I knew something fundamental had shifted. She wasn't the child caught between narratives anymore. She was the author of her own. Later that night, as we sat at my kitchen table eating takeout, Sarah looked up at me and asked, "Do you ever regret not fighting harder back then?" The question landed softly, but it carried weight. I considered it carefully. "I regret that the system failed us," I said. "I regret that you paid the price for adult lies, but I don't regret who you became." She smiled faintly. "I don't either." And in that moment, I realized the power had finally changed hands. Not because Ethan lost, but because Sarah and I stopped letting his version of the past dictate our future. The fallout didn't arrive all at once. It unraveled slowly, like a fabric finally giving way after being stretched too far for too long. The first public crack came when the defamation lawsuit Ethan threatened actually hit the docket, and then collapsed just as quickly. The judge dismissed it within minutes, citing the book's clear classification as fiction and the absence of any demonstrably false statements. The warning, however, was not subtle. "Mr. Harris," the judge said coolly, "the court strongly advises against further frivolous filings." The transcript circulated quietly among legal circles. Ethan didn't like that. What he liked even less was losing control of the narrative. Online, readers continued to praise Sarah's book. Reviews multiplied, interviews followed, radio first, then a small podcast, then a local newspaper feature. In every appearance, Sarah spoke with composure far beyond her years. She didn't attack her father. She didn't name him. She talked about neglect, about silence, about the long-term impact of not being believed. And people listened. Meanwhile, Ethan unraveled in private. His messages grew erratic. He sent Sarah long emails swinging wildly between rage and self-pity. One moment he accused her of betrayal. The next he begged her to remember the good times. She didn't respond. When he tried to reach out to me again, I blocked him. That simple action, blocking his number, felt monumental. For years, I'd braced for his words, anticipating the next accusation, the next manipulation. Silence, it turned out, was a form of peace I'd forgotten existed. The second wave of fallout came from his family, the same people who once sat in court and nodded. As my character was dismantled, now found themselves questioning the story they'd accepted so easily. Sarah's grandparents read the book. Then they watched Ethan rage at them for it. Then they saw the online videos of him confronting strangers who mentioned Sarah's success, his composure cracking in ways it never had when he was charming a judge. They didn't apologize publicly, but privately the distance was noticeable. Invitations stopped. Conversations grew strained. The family dynamics shifted, not because anyone declared a verdict, but because the truth made denial uncomfortable. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years, I'd been painted as the unstable one. Now, without me saying a word, the mask slipped. The most painful and necessary fallout, though, was emotional. For Sarah, success didn't erase the grief. In fact, it sharpened it. Some nights she called me, voice tight, admitting she felt guilty for hurting her father, even after everything. "I don't hate him," she said once. "I just don't trust him." "That makes sense," I replied. "Trust isn't automatic, it's built." She started therapy on her own terms, choosing a counselor who specialized in family trauma. Watching her walk into that process willingly, without being pushed or dismissed, felt like witnessing a generational curse loosen its grip. As for me, the fallout was quieter, but no less profound. For the first time in decades, I stopped defending my past. When people asked about the book, I didn't rush to explain my side or correct assumptions. I simply said, my daughter told her story. And that was enough. One evening, months after the book's release, I ran into someone from my old life, an acquaintance who'd known Ethan and me back when Sarah was small. I always wondered, she said hesitantly, what really happened. I met her eyes. You're hearing it now, I said. She nodded, shame flickering across her face. I'm sorry, she whispered. I accepted the apology, not because it erased the past, but because I no longer needed to carry it alone. Ethan faded from the center of our lives. Not dramatically, not with a final confrontation. He became irrelevant. The power he once held, over courts, over perception, over my access to my child, dissolved under the weight of his own behavior. And Sarah? Sarah moved forward. She enrolled in a creative writing program. She spoke at a conference about storytelling as survival. She laughed more easily. She slept better. One night over dinner, she looked at me and said, I don't feel like I have to prove anything anymore. I smiled. Neither did I. The fallout had done its work. The lies collapsed under their own weight. And what remained was something steady, honest, and unbreakable. The truth. There's a strange quiet that comes after a long war. Not relief exactly, not celebration, just a stillness where your body finally stops bracing for impact. That's where I am now. Sarah and I have a standing ritual, Sunday dinners. Nothing fancy, sometimes pasta, sometimes takeout eaten straight from the containers. We talk about her classes, her next writing project, the things she's excited about, and the things that still scare her. We don't talk about Ethan unless she brings him up. And when she does, it's without anger. It's with clarity. I don't need him to understand, she said once, stirring her tea. I just need him to stop rewriting my reality. I nodded, because that sentence could have come from my own mouth, 17 years ago. Watching Sarah build a life on her own terms has been the quiet redemption I never expected, not because the past stopped hurting, but because it finally stopped defining us. I used to think winning meant getting custody back, getting an apology, getting the truth acknowledged by everyone who once doubted me. Now I understand something deeper. Winning is raising a daughter who trusts her own voice. Winning is choosing boundaries over reconciliation when reconciliation demands self-erasure. Winning is standing beside your child, even when it costs you comfort, approval, or the illusion of peace. Sarah's book didn't destroy a family. It revealed one. And what it revealed wasn't pretty, but it was honest. If there's a lesson I carry forward, it's this. Love without protection is not enough. Truth without courage goes unheard. And silence, when used to keep the peace, often protects the wrong people. I don't know what the future holds for Sarah's relationship with her father. That decision is hers, and I trust her judgment more than I ever trusted the systems that failed us. What I do know is this. My daughter knows who she is. She knows her story belongs to her, and she knows, without question, that she was never abandoned by me. For 17 years, I was painted as the villain in someone else's narrative. Now I don't need to be redeemed. I just need to be present. And that finally is enough.